Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this discussion about a very unique not-for-profit alliance. The Nature Trust sees business and forestry team up to tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis head-on. In fact, it was exactly a year ago here during Climate Finance Week 2021 that we discussed Nature Trust and told you about it in its infancy. Now in 2022, we're back and we're trying to find out how Nature Trust has fared over the past 12 months, what they've been doing to make a difference. I'll introduce you first to our panel. I'm joined by Dr. Ciarán Fallon, Managing Director of Nature Trust and Director of Coillte Nature. Then we have Professor Yvonne Buckley, Professor of Zoology at Trinity College, Dublin. We have John Barcroft, Independent Sustainability Consultant and Director at the Nature Trust, and Brian O'Neill, Head of Communication, Sponsorship and Sustainability with Aviva Ireland. Ciarán, I'll come to you first. Just to recap, can you tell us what Nature Trust is?
Great. Helen, Nature Trust is it's a not-for-profit CLG that was set up by Coillte and Forestry Partners a year ago. And its idea is really to make an impact on the climate and biodiversity crisis at scale by delivering nature-based solutions, combining public and private capital together to really make an impact on the ground. It's a separate, distinct company from Coillte, but Coillte provides management services of myself and my team, and a service level agreement with the organisation and its contractors. And indeed, we also work with private forestry companies as well. What we do is we partner with businesses to bring capital into nature-based solutions. We buy land, we restore that land, and we manage it in perpetuity for climate and biodiversity and benefits to the planet.
Okay, and just to let you all know, we'd love if you took part in the discussion. There is an opportunity to ask questions to any of our panellists under the live stream. If you type your question in, we will do our best to get through as many of them as possible. So 12 months on from our last discussion, Ciarán, and you've been busy planting a lot of the right trees in the right places. How have you been getting on?
I can't believe it's 12 months since we've been here. It's been a really, really busy year. As you know, last year we launched with a €2 million fund for 200 hectares. So we spent the last year acquiring that land, gathering together the planting stock for that land. We were talking about 700,000 trees, and securing the consents to plant that land. So glad to say that the land is all in now. We've acquired that land. And in the summer, we decided to go again with a second issue of our Nature Woodland Credit, expecting maybe 2 or 3 investors, but delighted to have one. So we have a 400 hectare tranche, which has just been fully funded this year by Aviva, and delighted to be launching that today.
So it's a bit of an exclusive here in this studio today then to make this announcement.
Yeah, great to be here and talking about it. We're really going from doubling the size of the area and really pushing on with this agenda. So yeah, really great to be back here again.
Well, just to illustrate what's going on the ground with Nature Trust, we've got a little video that we're going to play for you now. so that gives you an idea of what Nature Trust have been doing over the last 12 months. Brian, I'm going to come to you now. You're Head of Communication, Sponsorship and Sustainability with Aviva Ireland, and Ciarán just told us about big investment you've made in Nature Trust. Why? Why Nature Trust?
We have been involved in sustainability for well over 30 years, and as a company, we're 325 years old. But strategically, we have been trying to address the climate issue for that period of time. And in 2021, following some activity, including being carbon neutral since 2006, we decided to announce that we were going to be net zero by 2040. And that was going to and is involving huge change to our business, and there's a huge amount of carbon reduction activity going on. But one big piece of this jigsaw is carbon removals and the whole diversity challenge. And from our perspective, we were keen to make significant investments across our core markets, and Ireland is one of our core markets. And we were looking to make a significant impact in afforestation. And obviously that brought us to the preeminent provider in this market, which is Coillte. So, today we're absolutely delighted to announce this investment. And as I said, from our point of view, obviously in the short term, there's an immediate impact in terms of what we're doing in this space. Obviously, it's a much longer term project that we're looking to deliver on in carbon removals, but also playing a more fundamental role in the replenishment of the biodiversity ecosystem.
Brian, there are quite strict regulations about sustainably investing for corporations, aren't there? So it's something that's quite strictly regulated.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, the term greenwashing has got huge currency in the media, and quite rightly, because it's really important that consumers, particularly those who want to invest sustainably, use their pension or their investment to say, look, I don't want to invest in certain industries, I don't want to invest in certain types of companies. And there's a term called ESG, and that stands for environment, social and governance. And it's become a very much used term by lots of providers. But it's really important that if you're going out promoting yourself as being involved or providing products under that heading, that you can stand over what you do. So here in Ireland, as part of the EU, we have a thing called the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And that ensures that whatever investment products, or indeed other products we market, we have to be able to demonstrate to the consumer, to the person investing or buying the product, that there is actually workings and a method, and that we're adhering to certain practices in putting that product or fund out into the market.
Jana, I'll come to you. You're a director at Nature Trust, and Brian mentioned the term greenwashing, which is a term that is bandied about a bit. How do you ensure that what Nature Trust is doing isn't enabling greenwashing?
Yeah, no, greenwashing is a significant issue, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for businesses to make sure that what they do isn't seen as greenwashing and isn't greenwashing at all. So I think when businesses, or indeed any organization, thinks about its sustainability strategy, it's like a 1,000-piece jigsaw. Now, not all the pieces are the same. There are some very large pieces, and those are the things that are actually changing its business model. There are other pieces which are important to do, and one of these is investing in nature-based solutions, and Aviva has a long track record of doing that. And for the Nature Trust, we work very closely with our investors to make sure that they understand that this is an investment for the long term. This is an investment across a lot of different environmental services. There's carbon sequestration, of course, but there's biodiversity and other services that the woodland that's being created are going to be providing. But also, this is additional. This work would not have been done without the investment to acquire the land that is going to be afforested. So we're very transparent. We think it's a very good product. It's robust. It's carried out professionally, and it's the reports that are provided then to the investor are available for that investor to use.
By additional, you mean these native trees would not be planted were it not for these investments?
That's correct, Helen. The land needs to be purchased. It needs to be planted. There are, of course, government grants, and there should be knowledge that there's government support for those, for fencing and for the planting of the trees. But acquiring the land is one of the biggest financial requirements, and that can only be done with investment from funders.
Yvonne, I'll come to you now, Professor of Zoology at Trinity College. We have a biodiversity crisis as well as a climate crisis. And what difference will these native woodlands make to the biodiversity in Ireland?
Right, so with the planting of new trees, you're basically trying to help the development of a new forest ecosystem. And importantly, this is native species. And it's a mix of native species. So when you plant in these trees that would not necessarily get there by themselves, if there aren't enough seed sources in the local area, you're increasing the tree diversity, obviously. But what you then see start happening is you start to change the biodiversity of the soil. So different soil organisms start to develop around these trees. Fungi start to, colonize the roots and make new connections. So actually the trees get connected together by fungi. You start to get new invertebrates coming in, insects and soil invertebrates coming into the area. These are much more dispersive, particularly our flying insects. So they'll come in and start to find the trees, they'll feed on them, they'll make habitat in there. But they'll also start to use the soil as well. So you start to see this gradual accumulation and change of biodiversity as the forests start to develop. And we already saw there from that nice video that there were changes in the community already. There was a lot of different plants there that wouldn't have been there before in and around the trees. So it's a long-term project. You don't get from an agricultural field to a lovely native forest like this background in a year or 2 years. It takes decades to actually develop.
It does take decades, but in the space of 12 months, would you see an improvement in the biodiversity in these sites?
I would say yes. I think you would see a change in the biodiversity. And so the word improvement is interesting. It depends on where you want to get to. So if what you want is a fully functional native woodland, then the first step is to get the right species in there that will form the structure of that native woodland. So you have this structural diversity developing. You have functional diversity developing by getting different species in there that are regulating nutrients in a different way. Biodiversity is multidimensional. So you can measure it in a lot of different ways. And you need to have a really clear idea of what it is you want. And I think with this project, there is a very clear idea that it's a diverse, functional native woodland is the ultimate objective here with high native woodland biodiversity. So that's a clear objective. And then you put in place the management, the steps that you need in order to get to that condition.
John, this is an ongoing relationship between Nature Trust and investors. There's constant communication. So in what way do you report back to the investors about how their investment is going?
Yeah, so part of Nature Trust, the agreement with the investor is to provide regular reporting on the site and opportunities also for Aviva employees to actually participate in some of the tree planting to actually really get engaged and get some dirt under the fingernails. And then there's a continuous process of reporting on, as the measurements start coming through on biodiversity, on carbon sequestration, on amenity value, on educational value, so that the investor can see that their money is being well spent, that woodland is actually being created. And it's a good thing that Aviva has been around for so long, because this is a long-term project as well. This is a 30 to 100-year project, and it will be continuous woodland cover. And those reports continue provided back to Aviva.
Brian, John mentioned getting dirt under your fingernails. I don't know if you've got dirt under your fingernails yet, but is that important for everybody in Aviva to be able to physically visit these sites and maybe play their part, whether it's planting trees or just digging the ground? Is that important that there's buy-in among staff then?
Absolutely. It's a key part of our sustainability strategy and practice. And we actually already have planted some trees, and we've had our staff visiting beehives. We've done work around the Aviva Stadium to put in a little mini biodiversity garden in there. So volunteering is absolutely critical. One, to engage our staff, but two, to enable them to give something back. So we give them 21 hours so that they can volunteer for causes that are dear to their heart. And that can be anything from digging trees, but also charities that they believe in. And that's all part of giving something back. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this. It's not just about, yes, we obviously want to hit targets in relation to carbon removal and reduction, but it's also a play about helping the country to address the crisis that you've so eloquently described, and address that by forestation, but other means of biodiversity we're interested in getting involved in as well.
And Ciarán, if we come to it from sustainability, it's a three-legged stool. As well as environmental sustainability, there's economic and social sustainability. And the social element of these woodlands, these will be open to the public to visit.
Yeah, as John said, the arrangement we have with Aviva is we will we will report on these forests for 30 years, but we will manage them for 100 years under contract. So as they're planted, it's bare land. For the first couple of years, you're talking about very young trees growing and beginning to establish canopy cover. But after 7 or 8 years, you're talking about something that looks like a native woodland, or is on the way to looking like a native woodland. At that point, we will appraise all the sites and look at the recreational potential for them. All these sites will be open access, so ultimately they're a community resource in an area, and they can be used for recreation, for academic research. We have some work with Yvonne, our colleagues in Trinity College, looking at natural capital measurements on these lands, and also just a place really to experience nature. I was very fortunate growing up, just had the luck to grow up beside a very small woodland beside where I lived, and me and every kid in the neighbourhood played there, lived there, and it really has a profound effect on you experiencing nature at a young age. So hopefully that'll have the same effect on other people in Ireland.
Okay, we have some questions coming in, and I would encourage you to keep sending in your questions. If you type them in the box under the live stream, we will do our best to get to as many of them. Raoul MP has sent in a question, and whether John or Ciarán, you want to address this. Is Nature Trust creating verified carbon offsets? Is that something either of you would like to?
No, it's not. It doesn't. Verified carbon offsets are retrospective, so they're looking at a project in the rear view mirror. So the project is planted, then you measure the carbon uplift, and they're verified, and somebody buys and retires them. These are forward-looking, so the money that Aviva is providing to us will be used to buy land, to plant that land with native trees and manage it into the future.
Okay, we have another question from Carl Byrne, who is a climate change student, and he's asking, is there scope or strategic consideration given for other forms of native woodland restoration? Think in particular of natural ecosystem regeneration and rewilding, and I can see both Ciarán and Yvonne nodding their heads. I'll come to you first with that, Yvonne.
Yeah, so rewilding is a really interesting term. It's a kind of habitat restoration, and rewilding can mean a few different things. When people talk about rewilding, they tend to think about passive rewilding, which is just removing human impact entirely and just letting an area develop as it would. That's one way of rewilding, but there are other different ways of rewilding as well. Things like, introducing wolves into Yellowstone Park is an example of rewilding, but that's a huge human intervention, to get that ecosystem functioning. Ultimately, with all rewilding or restoration projects, you want to get a functional ecosystem that doesn't require a lot of human intervention. But in order to get to that point, you might need quite a bit of human management to do things like control invasive species, so that you get the kind of woodland you want to actually get developing. You don't want a wall of rhododendron. You might even have to plant in species. If there's no seed sources around, that enables those species that you want, like a diverse suite of native species. In Ireland, we don't have very many, functional native woodlands actually on the ground. Our hedgerows are these green arteries that connect up woodlands all over the country. Those are really important seed sources, but they don't have all of the species that you would want in a functional native woodland. So planting in species may be a really important intervention that we have to do at the start in order to enable that ecosystem to subsequently assemble naturally and go along the trajectory, the ecological trajectory or route that we want it to develop along. Because a field left to its own devices could go in many different ways. And some of those might be very undesirable from a social point of view, from a biodiversity point of view, and even from a recreational point of view as well.
Okay, Ciarán, Carl's question there about other forms of native woodland restoration.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. We're planting up with two classes of native woodland, what are called GPC9 and GPC10. That's a suite of 17 native Irish tree species. The reason those schemes exist is because, well, Ireland has a low level of forest cover generally at around about 11.6%, but our native woodland cover is particularly low. So we have low levels of tree cover, you have low levels of seed sources. So I think Carl's question is really surrounding the idea of could you just allow native woodlands to regenerate? I would love to do that. I'd love to look at that in our next phase and find sites that actually have good native tree surroundings and a good seed source. At the moment, we're working at sites that are bare and generally don't have a seed source. To Yvonne's point, I think rewilding is a really interesting idea. It covers, in my mind at least, a spectrum of things. So it's not one thing in particular. And one thing I'd always be very careful is looking at invasive species, because I know in my own work within Coillte, in Coillte Nature, we're doing some large biodiversity restoration projects, and our biggest expenditure is on the removal of rhododendron and laurel. Very, very expensive and labour intensive. So I think sometimes rewilding, the idea of just sort of stepping back and allowing natural processes to take over, I think ultimately that should be the aim, but sometimes there is a management intervention required to actually set the clock and allow the natural processes to move on and govern themselves.
Okay. John, from the point of view of attracting investors to Nature Trust, does the fact that it's Irish-based and the impact will be felt in Ireland, does that make a difference?
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the key selling points of what Nature Trust does. It is local, it's directly relatable to our investors and employees in those investment companies, and they can actually go and see it. And when you see something like the video there where people get to enjoy the woodland that's being created and can see it developing, and thinking about Ciarán's point of growing up, it's a huge benefit for people to actually see woodland in action, where it's coming from. What started as was degraded land, maybe overbrowsed, with very little biodiversity value, moving into an area where, with time, you have a fully functioning woodland that represents what's a natural ecosystem in Ireland. So yeah, I think having it local resonates very strongly with investors, and something that we are always keen to promote.
And Brian, when we come to investing, you mentioned earlier that this is one big part of a jigsaw that Aviva is building, I suppose, to be a bit more sustainable. What are the other parts of the jigsaw? What else is Aviva doing?
Well, obviously, as I said, this is €5 million out of a £100 million that has been set aside just for nature projects such as this. But in addition to that, we're obviously offering all of our customers here in Ireland, and indeed other markets, the opportunity to get involved and invest, as I said before, in ESG funds. So, a lot of consumers look at the climate issues, and they decry sometimes the cost or the perceived pain. But investing sustainably is an opportunity to influence the market, but also whilst doing so without compromising your investment returns. And as a result of that, we've already invested over 11 billion in green and transition funds, 11 billion pounds. So in terms of strategically, it is a big investment, both in Ireland, it is a big part of an afforestation budget, but overall we're repivoting our business to be a sustainable business, both in everything we do, in terms of what we invest in on behalf of shareholders, what we get our customers to do. So this is a really, really important part, but to use John's term, of that jigsaw puzzle. But it is a big and complex jigsaw puzzle, as it needs to be if we're to make a meaningful contribution both in Ireland and internationally to the climate journey.
Yvonne, Ireland are, compared to the rest of Europe, we're not very good when it comes to trees. Less than 12% of our land is under forest, and we're particularly bad for native trees. It's only around 2% is under native trees. Why is it so important that it's native Irish trees?
Well, because they support such a wide diversity of other native species. So the native trees are like the architecture of a building, the trusses and supports. They provide the structure that things like lichens and mosses and ferns, insects, fungi, soil organisms all assemble around. So you're creating a scaffold for more biodiversity to accumulate. And we know that native species of plants support more native species of insects, for example, because they've co-evolved with those native insects over time. So oak trees, for example, support a huge number of native insect species, whereas something like rhododendron would not support very many native insect species at all. So there's basically a step change between a woodland composed of non-native species compared to a woodland composed of native species in terms of the extra biodiversity that comes in and starts to colonize. So that's why they're so important. And then they also provide a lot of ecosystem services to us, and we're doing some research at the moment on how biodiversity, woodlands, and other ecosystems, native ecosystems, provide ecosystem services. So these are things that people benefit from, like clean water, carbon sequestration, obviously, things like recreational opportunities, and lots of other benefits that we get from functional ecosystems.
And does Nature Trust, do these new native woodlands provide you with a research opportunity, particularly if you're there from the very beginning?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, as a scientist, I'm really interested in how biodiversity accumulates around these new sites and what the benefits of that biodiversity accumulation can provide to people. If we want to encourage more investment in biodiversity projects, it's important to show a return on that investment. Now, that return on investment may not be monetary. It may be in terms of better mental health for people. It could be in terms of mitigating flood risk. It could be in terms of carbon sequestered or nutrients recycled through the ecosystem. Or it could be just the intrinsic value of biodiversity in and of itself, which we as humans are evolved to appreciate. You know, so there's lots of different kinds of contributions we can get from projects such as this, and being able to monitor and quantify those brings it to the fore. It means that those services are no longer invisible to us. They're visible, and we appreciate them more, I think, when we can actually see them and quantify them.
Ciarán, obviously it's fantastic to get major investments like you're getting from Aviva, but it's finding suitable sites. Is that much of a problem for you? How constrained are you by that?
It is. In Ireland, we've very low land mobility. We've about 14,000 hectares of land in total that's sold every year. So that is a real challenge. We acquire our land through Coillte has dedicated land buyers within the organisation, and we deal directly with private forestry companies. But every single parcel of land that the Nature Trust acquires has been visited by our head ecologist, Dr. Declan Little. So one of Declan's key tasks to go on site is really to decide whether this purchase and this project would actually lead to biodiversity uplift. So obviously there are some sites out there that really shouldn't be forested, are better left as is or with some other use. So Declan makes an assessment on site, a baseline assessment of every site, and videos all sites and makes a recording of all sites. So in time we can actually see what the improvement has been between the bare site and the planted site after a reasonable duration, about 10 years.
John, you mentioned that you do report back to investors about the impact of their investment, but as well as that, the sites are being constantly managed in perpetuity. What does that mean? I mean, how long are these sites going to be managed for?
So the contract with Aviva is a 30-year contract, but the commitment is for 100 years, and it will be continuous forest cover. And the management intervention, as mentioned earlier, it is a little bit to begin with, to get the thing started, to get it reset, to get the right species in. But after that, the forest starts, or the woodland starts looking after itself to a certain extent. You know, we might initially put in fencing to keep browsing animals out so that the trees can get established, but after some period of time, the fencing can be taken away. And once you start getting a certain amount of scale, then the woodland itself looks after itself with minimal intervention, which is really the optimal way you want to go. Maybe you need to maintain paths and access for people to visit, maybe some tree clearance occasionally, or taking out single species. But really, a functioning ecosystem will do all the work for you. That's part of the beauty of the nature-based solution, is that you're using millions of years of evolution of a woodland to do a lot of work, which it's a lot smarter than we are probably, to do your work for you and to provide these benefits back to us.
Brian, you need to be patient with an investment like this. It takes a long time for a tree to grow. Is that something, I suppose, that you're conscious of, that this is a long-term thing?
Absolutely. If we were just simply looking to use carbon removals for as part of the carbon reduction target, solely to do that, you would go for an investment in afforestation that was focused on conifers. However, we, as I've stated already, were interested in a longer-term investment that has longer-term benefits for Ireland as a whole, and is not just simply about reducing carbon. Yes, the carbon reduction over the long term will align with our desire to be net zero by 2040. So there are benefits in that regard in the long term, but we're not looking for benefits in carbon in the short term. And as Ciarán has said, it will take time for those benefits to be realised, and we're absolutely explicitly aware of that. So for us, it is a long-term investment as part of our biodiversity strategy, which entails that sort of longer term horizon.
So for anybody else who might be interested in making that long-term investment, we have another video to show you now that I suppose might give you an idea of why you might like to get involved with Nature Trust. And the questions have been flying in, so I'm going to put a few more of those questions to our panel. Christine Livet has sent in a message or a question. We know Ireland needs billions of dollars for restoration work, including woodland restoration. What is the role you see institutional capital playing to fill this gap? And what is the pathway to crowding in this capital? I don't know whether John or Brian. John, do you want to come to it?
Well, as I said, from our point of view, this is an investment that is part of our overall climate target and our climate program. But there is, in addition to that, I think one of the things that is being developed is a way that industry can invest in natural solutions in other ways. We already have products and funds that allow customers to invest through those funds into nature-based and other types of solutions. So there's possibly an opportunity there going forward. This, at the moment, is a direct investment from Aviva. There is no other onward use of this investment. It's purely, as I said, for the benefit of our climate strategy and indeed the onward benefits to the country. But going forward, the use of capital is a key lever to assist in the achievement of that.
Okay. A question from Michael Nolan. How is land acquired for planting native forests? When farmland comes on the market, are sellers or auctioneers approached? I had a recent experience of disposing of 26 acres of land inherited from a relative. I'd love to have had looked at native woodland as an option rather than just selling it. So how do you go about acquiring the land, Ciarán?
We go through a network of auctioneers and private forestry companies. So we're very fortunate in Ireland to have a really strong ecosystem of private forestry companies. And within Coillte is a very big organisation, so it has land buyers out all the time buying and selling land. So we use all those challenges, but our channels rather. But we're really we're all ears. I mean, if people have land and they're interested in it going into native woodlands in the long term, as John was saying, the idea of the Nature Trust is to buy this land and manage it in perpetuity. So if that's attractive to people, we're really interested in hearing from you, and just contact us through the website.
And staying with land, Philip O'Byrne has asked, does this not drive up the price of agricultural land, taking it out of farmers' hands? Why aren't you paying farmers to plant trees on their land?
I think it's both. It's not one or the other. I think, Ireland needs more forests, needs more trees. So there's a new forestry program being developed at the moment. Undoubtedly, that'll include incentives for private forest landowners to forest their land. So I would strongly support that. I think that's really important. This is really looking at land that people are interested in selling. We don't tend to compete on land that is good agricultural land. Simply, we're priced out of that market. So we tend to look at land that is more marginal and very well suited to establishing native woodlands. I suppose, the forest estate is going to be a combination between public and private. And as I was saying earlier on, all these forests are open access to the public. And I suppose that's the little distinction we would make, is that private forests tend to be at the discretion of the private landowner. These will be open to everybody to use.
Okay. Yvonne, if we look at, I suppose, how do we measure all the different multiple benefits of planting native woodlands?
Absolutely. So one of the ways that we're looking at is developing natural capital accounts. So natural capital is the stocks, the stuff, the nature that's in the ground out there in the world, and you quantify it by looking at how much there is, the extent, and then the condition that it's in. And those two things together tell you how much you've got and what condition it's in. And you can then report that on a balance sheet. So this is a quantification of the kinds of habitat, the kinds of species that you have on the ground. Once you have that information, what we're looking to do is use models to connect the natural capital part, the stuff, to the services that it provides, the benefits it provides to people. So by quantifying how much we have, what condition it's in, we can then use a model to predict, okay, what kinds of services are we likely to get from this? Are we likely to get carbon sequestration? At what rate? Are we likely to get clean water? In what quantities and what condition? Are we likely to get recreational visitors coming to the site? So we can use modelling to then look at, okay, what happens if we put management in place to increase the amount we have, or management to improve the condition of the biodiversity that we have by fencing to exclude deer, or by managing invasive species, for example. What kinds of return do you get for investing in those management strategies in terms of the ecosystem services that are provided? So this then provides a really clear rationale for investment in acquiring more land, planting more native woodland, or different kinds of management that you might do to improve the biodiversity values and improve the ecosystem services that are provided to people. And that can encourage more investment in biodiversity projects like this.
We touched on regulations earlier, but another question has come in. What's the future direction of these nature-based products, and should there be more regulation?
Yes, I might take that, Helen.
Yeah.
I mean, nature-based solutions are emerging more and more as one of the ways of tackling both the biodiversity crisis and the climate change crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, these are a very efficient and effective way of both sequestering carbon and creating biodiversity and the environmental benefits that Yvonne spoke about earlier. So if you think of something like a mangrove swamp, where the mangroves have been taken away for development, you immediately lose the protection for the mangrove from storm surges, but also the species that need the mangrove trees to develop as hatchlings in the fishing industry. So restoring a lot of environmental ecosystems, not just natural woodland, but all over the world, and this goes to an earlier question about how is this going to be financed. Well, there's, I don't know if it's billions or trillions, but there needs to be the trillions are going into developing nature-based solutions and trying to get to that position where the ecosystem is providing the solution to the challenges that we have at the moment. Regulation-wise, there's work on the earlier sessions today. There's those standards that are coming in on nature-based solutions and natural capital. And if you see more and more of those standards, the regulation improves as they come through.
Okay, Clodagh Cahill has sent a question in. How do you see the tourism economy fitting into the funding of biodiversity projects? Anyone like to take that up? Yep.
Yeah, there's some really interesting projects going on around rewilding in Europe, actually, where consortia of tourism providers come together. And I think the European Investment Bank provides financing around this. So a lot of tourism industry in Ireland and in Europe and worldwide relies on these natural areas, these natural assets. They're a huge draw for tourists. But one of the issues is if you get the wrong kinds of tourism, or you get too many people in one spot, or damage being done, you're actually degrading the asset you're relying on. So you need to get investment back into that asset, and this is the whole natural capital approach. So you can get consortia who all rely on the same natural capital asset. The Wild Atlantic Way in Ireland would be a great example. If you can get a consortia of tourism operators to come together and say, right, we need to protect this asset, we need to do more in terms of improving its biodiversity, so that we can make this attractive and sustainable going forward as a tourism asset, that can work, and you can get financing for those kinds of projects at scale if you can get consortia coming together. Because often it's not just one tourism industry relying on a single asset, it's lots of industries relying on the same asset, and it's important that they come together and think about, okay, how can we actually promote the sustainability of our industry, which relies on this asset, by improving it, by protecting it, by making it sustainable in the long term.
Ciarán, peatland restoration is another thing that Nature Trust are starting to look into.
Yeah, we are. I mean, on the woodlands, when we were here last year, we were announcing 200, this year 400. I think we can get realistically to a scale of maybe about 1,000 hectares a year. But the land constraint that we spoke about earlier on is eventually going to limit it. There's a ceiling to the amount that we can do. But we're really interested in doing some work around peatland restoration, particularly western peatlands, the shallower peats along the western seaboard, which are a tremendous store of carbon, in some cases degraded, in some cases emitting carbon as we're speaking now, but also with their own unique ecology. And these habitats, with Britain leaving the EU, these are now unique bog habitats within the EU 27. So really important gems, and we're working very closely with a private funder to develop a very large-scale project in this space, in peatland restoration space, which we hope to announce very shortly. I think that'll be the start of a lot of work in peatlands. We need a lot of capital to flow into peatlands. To restore a single hectare, which is about the size of a soccer pitch, of a peatland to high standard, costs about €5,000. So it is a huge challenge, and we need hundreds of millions of euros coming into this area to really deliver the impacts we need over the next 2 decades.
Yvonne, Ciarán said our peatlands are really important gems. Are they?
Absolutely, 100%, yeah. They've been severely degraded and reduced over time. So a lot of our peatlands now are no longer functioning as intact hydrological units. They're one of the major services that peatlands provide is this, when it rains, they capture the water, they're like a giant sponge, they hold on to it, and then they let that out very, very slowly, so they can mitigate floods. Now, as we know, the predictions from climate change are that we'll get more intense rainfall during the winter, in particular in Ireland. We saw some pretty intense rainfall today and yesterday, so we're getting a taste of it. And our peatlands are a huge resource that we can use to buffer ourselves from the impacts of flooding that's going to, that's coming down the road to us. We're already seeing, and it's coming down the road in spades. So protecting our peatlands gives us this resilience that we're going to need to get through the climate shocks that are coming towards us.
Brian, Ciarán touched on just how expensive undertakings like this are. So I suppose from the point of view of the business world, the corporate world, why is this something, or why would you encourage, or how would you encourage other businesses to invest like Aviva have?
Because I think you've heard very clearly from the other speakers, this is a biodiversity crisis, and the country is in a biodiversity crisis. And I see from the government's plans that they expect to have 22 million trees planted, or 440, I think, by 2030. So it's incumbent on the corporate sector to give something back and to play its part. From our point of view, yes, we're trying to do that, but again, to some of the points about the impact of climate change, if it continues at the current rate of change, then our business as an insurance company, as an investment company, will be severely impacted in a negative way. So there's both a societal obligation, but also a common sense. We've got to, this is, to use that term, this is an existential crisis, and we've all got to play a part. And that's why we're very happy, to invest in this particular afforestation project. And as I said, it is not, it's by no means the end of the story for us. There's more work to be done in order to fully play our part. And I would encourage other institutions, for all the good reasons we've talked about today, to get involved in these type of projects and get involved in addressing the biodiversity crisis.
John, are you seeing a healthy interest from potential investors in Nature Trust?
Yes, no, it's very encouraging given that it was only last year when the Nature Trust was up and running with its first investor. So it's 12 months in, and there's a lot of interest and demand for the product that we're providing and the service that we provide. So I think the Nature Trust and what Aviva has invested in provides something that companies can relate to. It's local, it has a stream of benefits, and it resonates with them. So in a sense, it sells itself. We'd like it to keep selling it and keep doing it. So as to echo Brian's comments, if there's anybody watching who would like to find out more, contact the Nature Trust through the website, and we can talk about potential opportunities for investment in the next year.
And Ciarán, Coiltte's involvement obviously is very important to Nature Trust, both from a reputational point of view, but also from a practical point of view. Even the seed bank that Coillte have enables this to happen in a very natural way.
Yeah, I mean, the reason Coillte is involved is Coillte is a state forestry company. So it was established in 1989, and it wants to play a role within the context of the climate and biodiversity crisis. It has a big machine through our organisation and our very skilled contractor base. So the Nature Trust is a way of a small cog turning a much bigger gear. So our board has agreed to provide a service level agreement to the Nature Trust from Coillte for forestry services and land management services at zero margin, so it's simply at cost. And also the Nature Trust, because it's a separate, distinct legal company, it's outside the control of Coillte, it can deal directly with other providers as well, private forestry companies and so on. The reason, I suppose, Coillte earlier on this year announced a new strategic vision, and part of that was enabling the afforestation of 100,000 hectares of land, of which half will be native woodlands. So the Nature Trust is part of that enabling process.
Okay, and then on a practical level, not only the skills you have, the tools you have, but the seeds you have. I mean, you've got everything there that's needed.
Absolutely. I mean, I was saying earlier on that it's quite a simple model in many ways. Really you just need land, you need seeds, and you need the necessary consents to get moving.
And you need the money.
And you need the money, absolutely. The money to make it all work and to acquire the land. But the seeds themselves, we have an enormous seed bank and a huge tree nursery, and we can draw on that. For a project like this, we were talking about 1.2 million seedlings, plus, in fact, because there will be a lot of filling in. So that is a huge commitment, and it takes about 3 years to raise that stock. So I was delighted to hear this year is going to be a very good mast year for oak. Mast trees infrequently have these years where they produce an abundance of seed, so we'll be out very soon saving lots of oak seed all over the country using our network of contractors, growing that out in our nurseries, initially under cover and eventually out in fields. So we have really good, strong plants in 3 years' time to fulfil orders to come.
So we've announced the investment, the Aviva investment of 5 million today, Brian, and has the work physically started, or when will the work physically start?
Well, as you've heard from Ciarán, they will now start to purchase the sites over a 2 to 3 year period. And Nature Trust have already identified a number of sites, but they can now go ahead and actually acquire those. And the seeding process will take until April 2027. So even that's a medium-term objective to obviously have all of that in place. But as what we've announced is we are making the investment so that Nature Trust now can get on and do what they are expert in doing, which is to actually make this happen. And
you're becoming an expert in forestry and native woodland.
Yeah, well, it's been a steep learning curve, but one I've really enjoyed with the group here and elsewhere, and I'm glad because we all need to upskill and educate ourselves on these topics, because this, for all the reasons we've discussed, is something that needs to be addressed and addressed urgently at a national level and indeed throughout commercial organisations.
John, any potential investors watching this, what should they do?
So first of all, think of budget and how much they'd like to invest, and I'd encourage them to think big because Aviva and others have led the way on that. Think about what's important to that organisation, and a lot of organisations organizations and businesses, and including non-businesses like universities and government bodies, they have different needs, different range of employees. Have they got operations in Ireland? So will this be a project that would suit them? I'd hope that the answer would be yes. So think of the budget, think and understand and make sure they educate their board that this is a long-term process. This is not something that's a quick win. It's a win in the sense that once the money is invested and the contracts are signed, then the Nature Trust can start doing its work. But this is a long cycle, which is in many cases a good thing for people to exercise their patience and not look for something to happen the next day. So as long as the company is happy to do that, get in touch with the Nature Trust and we'll start having those discussions.
And Yvonne, I leave the final word to you from a science point of view. Why should people invest in this?
From a scientific point of view, we are at the stage now of having to do massive restoration projects. We don't have all the answers right now. So being involved from the ground up for us as researchers enables us to find new and better ways of doing this kind of restoration and connecting what we do on the ground to the kinds of benefits that people are going to get at the end or throughout the entire process. There is no end project here. Hopefully, if everybody does their job around here, we'll have the money to invest. The woodlands will develop and they'll continue to provide services over the decades and centuries ahead of us. And this is actually a bit of a step change in terms of restoring Ireland's woodlands, which previously covered 80+% of the country. So going from 2% to something bigger than 2%, we might not get to 80%, but it'll be a huge improvement on where we are now, and to be in at the ground in terms of being able to do the research to help that to go better and provide more to us, to the people of Ireland, would be fantastic.
Great. Okay, and if any of you would like to find out more about Nature Trust, we'll direct you to their website, which is naturetrust.ie, and the email is info@naturetrust.ie. And I'd like to thank our panel for joining us. Ciarán, Yvonne, John and Brian, thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your day.